Okay, hope that works. So I'm going to run through quite a lot of information quite quickly, and we'll have time to get into it in the Q&A afterwards. And also you'll be able to watch, I will go through some of the slides quite fast, but you'll be able to watch those back on the recording when we put that up on YouTube. This, there we go, working. I'm going to talk about three slightly different areas. First of all, I'm going to look at the numbers, what we know about statistics about adoptions in Britain, in specifically England and Wales for these ones, and what those numbers tell us and what we can find out from some of the extra work that was done during the 1950s, 60s, through to the 70s on adoptions. And that will tell us what the demographic trends were in the numbers. And then I'm going to talk about the adoption work that was going on from sort of 1960 onwards. I'll talk about the British Adoption Project and something called the Adoption Resource Exchange, and then specialist adoption agencies, and then what adopter organisations, and if we have time, maybe the social work organisations were doing around that time. And then very briefly at the end, I'm going to touch on adoption support. I don't think we'll have a lot of time to get through to that, but I will show you what's in my head and what I've put out onto paper about that. Oops, okay, so it's okay. So this is just, we're talking about the 1960s, 70s, and so on. We're talking about direct and very blatant discrimination, racism, and ableism. And this isn't just history, this is lived experience for someone in the room. So I've picked as far as I can. I am not showing you the worst of it, but I'm showing you enough to give you a sense of what was going on at the time. Hopefully it will be treated sensitively enough. And please, when we have the discussion afterwards as well, just be aware that some people actually have direct experiences of this. And also, I'd just say pay attention to the language, because it's really quite telling in some cases. And the first thing I want to talk about is the numbers. I've got two charts. This is the first chart where we do have numbers about so-called illegitimate births, and this is for England and Wales only. I have not added the other nations in. I've taken this from 1927 when the first adoption orders were issued, and I've gone through to the 1980s when you can see at the end there's no real relationship between those rates. They just diverge massively. There are a few things we can know from here. First thing is that in the early days, so when adoptions were first issued, not all adoptions were done by adoption order. People were still doing informal adoptions. So those numbers don't really go up together. And then when you get to World War II, you see a sharp rise. You see the first sharp rise in illegitimacy rates, and you see a corresponding quite a sharp rise in the number of adoption orders. And then it all falls off again. And then in the 1950s, it sort of starts to climb. And as those rates climb, then the adoption order numbers climb. Now, these are not directly related to each other because not everybody who was an illegitimate child was adopted, and not everyone who was adopted was illegitimate. And of course, there are also adoption orders in respect of step-parent adoptions and kinship adoptions as well. So it doesn't tell us the whole story, but we can see there's a broad relationship there in some of the time periods between these numbers. And then we can also see that from the peak in 1968, the rates fall quite sharply. And then the numbers of adoption orders continue to go down, but the numbers of illegitimate births continue to go up due to different social changes and attitudes after that. So that this is one way of looking at it. It's not the whole story, but the concern, the information collected was not really about adoption, it was more about legitimacy. So up to 1950, they only really collected the numbers and which kind of court the adoption order was made in. So there was very limited information about adoptions up to 1950. And then from 1950, they decided they wanted to look at what happened to illegitimate children. So the government started collecting more information about adoptions because one of the outcomes was adoption. And this culminated in a study called the Generation Study of Illegitimate Children in 1965, published in 1965. And it was quite sort of heavy statistical work. They tried to account for children who died, and they tried to do it in cohorts of different generations. And that I've got a resource pack that I will put in the chat at the end, and I'll put on the YouTube video as well. I've got a link where you can go and look at that yourself if you're interested. And also all the other statistical volumes, they're all at the LSE library online. And so in 1950, when they decided they wanted to study this a bit more, they went back to 1927 and they sampled the adopted children register to estimate how many adoptions were of legitimate and illegitimate children, because they wanted to know that for this study, which is something that I wanted to put in here because the government keeps telling us that they can't really study outcomes of adoptees, but they could do it in 1950. They sampled the adopted children register to find out what they wanted to find out. It's not impossible to find out mortality rates for adoptees. I don't believe them. And then this is the conclusion from that study. You can see that up to 23% of children who were born illegitimate ended up being adopted. And again, that's a fairly average sort of figure. What this doesn't account for here again is whether they were stranger adopted or kinship adopted or step-parent adopted. But we have a lot more information being collected. This is 1950, about the children that were adopted, right? So we've got them divided up by age, we've got them divided up by whether they were legitimate or not, and crucially for us, we've got the relationship to the adopter in this one. So I'm just going to zoom in on this one. And you can see that they kept a record of whether they were adopted by a parent, another relative, or someone who was not related to them. So we can take those numbers, which is what I've done, just added them up for each of the years we have them available for, and we can estimate roughly what the numbers of stranger adoptions were during those years. It stopped in 1972, I think. So this is that chart. On the green lines, the non-relative was the ones we were just looking at, and then they switched it so they were not asking whether that they were father or mother or otherwise related. They just asked whether they were a parent. So we've got two slightly different sets of numbers. We've got non-relative and then non-parent. We map these against the adoption orders have gone from 1950, and you can see broadly speaking, there's a certain proportion of adoption orders were issued in respect of for stranger adoptions, with the exception of after 1968, this number goes down much more sharply than the number of adoption orders. So we get from, was that 16,000 down to 9,000 in 1972. So that really was a drop off in the number of children available for adoption in those years. I think between 1958 and 1968, hang on, 8,000, and then 1968, 16,000. So it doubled, right? The number of stranger adoptions doubled in that baby scoop era, and then it dropped off very sharply, right? Which is not something that we could find out without adding those numbers up. Unfortunately, they didn't keep track. There's a few years later on where they talk about the same similar stats, but that really just shows that the vast majority of adoption orders were in respect of were stranger adoptions, but the numbers are much smaller in the 2000s and so on. So this fall in the number of adoptions, available children for adoption, was very much noticed, and it was anticipated by the adoption sector. So this is one director who's just said the supply has gone down sharply. This is speaking in 1976. And this is someone who had worked in adoption for some time and continued to work in adoption and adoption support. We will come back to her. And then, but this didn't just happen in the 1970s. It had been, changes in the way adoption was done had been going on since the early 60s and even earlier in other countries. So I just want to go back, first of all, to, so this is actually 1959. So this International Social Service it started out as a sort of refugee and displaced people charity, trying to reunite people. And of course, there was a lot of displacement during, and a lot of loss of family members during World War II. And then they started arranging adoptions. Most of them were to the USA. And then later on, they started getting involved. They're based in Geneva. They started getting involved with the negotiations over the Hague Conventions and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and were instrumental in that happening. And they still exist. And there's a timeline on their website, and I've put a link in the resources. What they did in Britain was they started bringing children from Hong Kong, which was, of course, a British colony at the time. And the first one, this was 1960 or 61, 60. And the first child who was brought under this scheme was actually a kinship adoption. So it was the wider family had been taking care of them in Hong Kong, were no longer able to, and they were able to locate the child's aunt and reunite. And she was married to a white British man living in England, and they were able to reunite and bring him over, and he was adopted by her. So that was the sort of work they had been doing. And then they got into bringing over children from Hong Kong orphanages. And several dozen were brought over the next few years. I've had to blank out so much on some of these stories because there were parents who were quite happy to have publicity and be photographed and have their names in the paper. And the airline, so BOAC, had an arrangement. They were quite happy to have the publicity of bringing them over and allowing someone to accompany them from the orphanage or from International Social Service in Hong Kong. So that was the first sort of scheme. They had a lot of demand, and they had to close their lists at some point. There were quite a few stories in the paper. Here we are, happiest couple in the world adopt a Chinese baby. I have blanked out the face of the child, but they do not look happy. So after this scheme, they then collaborated, this started in 1964, on something called the British Adoption Project, which was to get British-born children of colour adopted into British families. Right? And so there was the International Social Service British branch. It was Bedford College of the University of London, and it was supported by the government, and they had charitable funding. And this was the second sort of phase, and there was a lot of anxiety about so-called unadoptable children, and this was an attempt to run a project that was sort of attempt to have adoptions placements into British families, whether they were mixed couples or white couples, and to sort of ease to find out how they could make these adoptions successful. Right, they were going to follow up after 4 years, and they followed up later. But this is coming from or inspired by, I think, the Indian Adoption Project in the USA. I've put links in the resources to that. But that was specifically a project to assimilate native indigenous children into colonizer families, white settler families in the US. So there's a connection. I'm sure there's a connection. And one of those connections could well be the project director. So the project director was a Canadian, actually, and the similar things were going on in Canada, as some of you know. She was the superintendent of child welfare for British Columbia before she took that job. So she came. So there's a connection there. We're copying projects that have been taking place, right? And this is the brief, or this is what they plan to do. They were doing it within, I think it was 50 miles radius of London. They specifically excluded children of East and Southeast Asian heritage from this because they were more adoptable, right? They wanted to take the less adoptable hierarchy of racism here, really, but they wanted to take the children who were considered less adoptable and place them. And as part of this, they set up something called the Adoption Resource Exchange. There was a change of director. So the second director, after about 18 months, Lois Rayner, came from America. So she was an American adoption social worker, and she set up this Adoption Resource Exchange, which was a brokerage or a facility for adoption agencies and local authorities to match children who were considered hard to place children. Again, I think this was named after the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America, which was followed on from the Adoption Resource Exchange, from the Indian Adoption Project in the USA. Lois Rayner is second to the right, from the right on that picture. She ended up writing the first report, which is published in 1970s. And then the Adoption Resource Exchange was set up as part of this, but it carried on after the British Adoption Project finished. And one of the people who was working on it was Phillida Sawbridge, who we saw the quote from earlier, who had been involved with the British Adoption Project. So this was a way for adoption societies and local authorities became members. They signed up as members, and then they would get information about available children and share it. It's about matching. And yeah, and you can see that she's drawing on experience from the United States. So uh, there's definitely an influence there, and some of these people went on study trips to the USA to find out more about how things were done there. These are the early members of the Adoption Resource Exchange. You can see Birmingham, the founding members were Birmingham Children's Department, Dr. Bernardo's, Guild of Service Edinburgh, we'll come to them later, the Agnostic Independent Adoption Society, who had been the Agnostics Adoption Society, Oxford Children's Department, and Somerset Children's Department. And then so this is the Bath, Core and Bath. So this is the British Association of Adoption and Fostering. This is the record of their archive, which is in LSE. And they were sort of folded into and merged with Bath in 1980. So in 1978, they were properly incorporated and they merged. So this is the Professional Association of Adoption Agencies responding to these changes and merging their resources. And then we come on to adopter organisations. So this is parent-to-parent information and advice services, I think it's called. That this is Adoption UK. So this was founded by parents who were looking to adopt children through the Adoption Resource Exchange or adopting children of colour in general. They had two purposes really. This couple were founders. They're called Hilary and David Chambers. They had 3 daughters, and then they adopted a child. They had two purposes. One was to share information, and eventually they also had a list of available children. So they had a book that the branch organisers would have at their home, and prospective adopters could go and see it. But that was one of their purposes, was to share information and sort of support each other. But another of their purposes was to lobby government for change to make it easier for children to be adopted out of care, right? And yeah, that's Hilary Chambers. And there was another woman called, Sheila Crawford, who was also involved. And then I haven't talked about social work reform, but we'll come to that. She was pushing for, she set up this group called AGRO as well, Adoption and Guardianship Reform Organisation. Again, so the PPIS were pushing councils to sign up to the Adoption Resource Exchange or to make children available for adoption. And they were also pushing for reform at the national level. They gave evidence to the Houghton Committee and so on for so-called hard to place children. They would criticise council if a council hadn't signed up for the Adoption Resource Exchange and so on. And one thing the Adoption Resource Exchange had a television program. So they had a World of Action program, and they'd learned this from America, that advertising children was a good thing. And they had children appear on films on this program, and then they were manning phone lines, and people were calling in and writing in, offering to adopt them. So there's quite a bit of controversy about it, but they, yeah, they decided that was a good thing to do, and and within 6 months, I think only one of the children had found a placement from that. But they did it again the next year. They continued to do that, and then Phillida Sawbridge, 1976, left Adoption Resource Exchange and went to work to head up a new adoption agency, Parents for Children, that was founded, or some of the people from PPIS were involved in it as well. Sheila Crawford was one of the driving forces behind it, and that was specifically to find placements for children with disabilities and older children, but mostly children with disabilities. Again, they advertise them, so I've had to cover up 4 places there. They would advertising was one of the methods that they used. And then finally, sort of briefly, I'm just going to talk about adoption support services, because this was, you probably able to see the progression here, right? Pushing for adoptions and then finding out that actually it's not enough to just arrange an adoption, that more support is needed. And this is where the Guild of Service comes in. So the Guild of Service was what we now call BirthLink. So they were, and before that they were called the, I can't remember, the, it's in the resources, the Edinburgh. They're Edinburgh based, right? They were an adoption agency, but they also supported some mothers to stay with their children, and they had sort of a wraparound service, really. They were there. I've put a link in the resources to all their annual reports are online, but 1967 and 1968 are quite interesting, because they could see this coming, and they had their finger on the pulse, and they sort of knew. They were part of the Adoption Resource Exchange. Social work reform actually happened a bit earlier in Scotland, because in England they were setting up DHSS. So 1968 they had their social work bill, and then they sort of, yeah, they knew what's going on. They had set up meetings for adopters, groups for adopters, and they realised that this was something that was needed, right? We've learned through these meetings that it is not enough for a society to arrange adoptions and provide no follow-up after the first few months. Our help is needed over a much longer period than has hitherto been thought, and we must be prepared to take the initiative in offering a service and not leave it to adopters to approach us. So there's sort of the seed there of adoption support is something that's going to be needed. And this was coupled with the change in the law in England allowing adoptees access to their birth records. So now we've got people who may be searching and maybe being searched for. And surprise, surprise, here's Phillida Sawbridge again. She goes off and she's the first director of the Post-Adoption Centre. So now moving into adoption support, right? What happens? Support is needed for people who've been through this. And then she's the so that's 1986. She's a co-author in 1992 of this book, Half a Million Women, Mothers Who Lose Their Children by Adoption. So these are the same people, right? They've been working in adoption, and they're now realizing that it's painful, and people need support, and they're the ones that offer the support and set up the organizations to offer the support, right? And then we start to get attachment disorder. So we start to get children, adoptees, misbehaving, acting out, etc. So that again, this is so now we need to help. We need to support with that. Okay, start to get diagnoses. When love is not enough, 1996. Now we've got the spectre of child to parent violence, which is a hot topic these days, and we've now got post-adoption centre being, well, they're inviting Nancy Verrier to speak at a conference to talk to them about what's needed, what sort of support is needed. And then just so you can sort of you can put two and two together, right? And the last two slides are just what me trying to get into my head what I think this system really looks like. So we've got the red line is the child, right? The red line is the commodity that moves through. You've got the brokers in the middle, the religious institutions and the adoption agencies. They're getting funding from government, they're fundraising from the public, and then they are getting children from mothers, but also those mothers have to pay, right? Or their families have to pay mostly for the childcare that is given in the institutions before the baby is passed on to the adopters. They also pay in labour, some of them, right? They're also working in mother and baby homes when they're there. And then the child goes to the adopters, and sometimes the adopters give donations back. So that's what's sort of in my head about what this system looked like. And then finally, when you get adoption support, it's the same system, right? So you add adoption support agencies in, they're getting funding from government, they're supporting adopters, and they're still sourcing children from mothers. And then you have this sort of circle in the middle where personnel are going back and forth, right? So the same people are providing the adoption support as were creating the adoptions, and and I haven't really made it clear in here, but some of those adoption support agencies are run by adopters as well. And then, so if someone gets laid off by Adoption UK, they can go and get a job at Adoption England, or people can move around like Phyllis de Sawbridge moved around within that. So that expertise, and this is something that we have been struggling with as adoptees and presumably as mothers as well. The fact that it's very hard to get support outside of this system, right? So all the money stays in the system, all the so-called expertise, so it stays in the system, and the people who are experts are these people who've been working in adoption this whole time. And then just to say thank you, and I haven't been blogging very regularly, but you can sign up to my blog at adoptionhistory.uk, and also I've got an email address for that.